Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first in a while, episode of Choose Your Issues, the podcast of the Objectivism Program here in the Salem Center at the University of Texas, Austin. I'm Greg Salmieri. We had our last episode. Well, you and I haven't done an episode in the longest time. Yeah, Matt Bateman and I did one a couple of weeks ago on education, and last week, instead of having an episode of this, we had you giving a talk on abortion rights. What we're going to talk about today is the topic of individual rights generally, and kind of bridging off some of the things we discussed in the wake of that conference. But a couple of matters of business first. We're not going to be here next week, or rather next Tuesday, because I will be in Athens at the Ayn Rand Con, and speaking about something closely related to individual rights. So this conversation is part of my prep for that. But we will have an event next Friday, that is a week from Friday, and we'll stream it on this channel and so forth. It'll be a dialogue between me and Devin Westhill of, I'm forgetting the full name of his organization, but it has to do with promoting equality of opportunity. And we'll be talking about whether there's a conflict between free speech and social justice. Devin is someone who I knew a long time ago when I was teaching at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He was a student of mine back then. And since then, he's gone on to become a lawyer, to work at the Federalist Society, to work in, I forget which department, in an administrative role in the Trump administration, and now is heading up this organization promoting equality of opportunity. So I'm not sure how much we're going to agree and disagree on this topic, but it'll be interesting to have a discussion about it, and we're not prepping too much for it, so I think a lot will come out on how we each understand these issues in the session. So that will be, that's a topic I'm excited to talk about. I'm excited to have a show on it, and that'll be next week on Friday. So today, individual rights. I feel like, should we acknowledge anything in the news in the past couple of weeks? Today was a big news day. We had the indictment of Trump unsealed and so forth. But I don't know that there's that much to say about it.
No. I mean, there's really nothing, there's no details that I scrounged for them, but couldn't find anything new or interesting in the actual indictment. It's just like 34 counts of the same thing.
Yeah.
All the different places that he wrote down the fraudulent statement, there's a count for each. And we probably won't find out anything for another month when they have the next hearing.
Just on an issue of, is there anything to say philosophically about this? I'll just give my thing. I think the campaign finance laws are wrong and bad and a violation of free speech to begin with. The charges against Trump are business, misleading accounting that have been escalated to felonies because they have to do with campaign violations. There's a lot of ways in which this prosecution seems ill-advised and a stretch. A lot of people are drawing wider political messages from that about democracy, rule of law, etc. Prosecutors overreaching is a pretty common thing. In this case, it does seem like it's likely politically motivated. It's a little bit sad that the first indictment of a sitting president should be on something kind of tenuous and dubious, particularly when there are other crimes he's being investigated for that are more serious. Whether any of those he should be charged for, I don't know. We'll wait to see the indictments. I expect these will get pushed down to misdemeanors, and probably that's what should happen, but we'll see.
I've got no further comments on it, but maybe I should say something about what the genesis for this week's topic is.
Go ahead.
And just for those who weren't able to see the talk that I gave last week, it was about abortion rights, and I'm concerned, and it was why there is an individual right to abortion. I think a lot of the thinking on this topic spends. I mean, basically, what I argued for in the talk was that a lot of people will debate about the nature of the fetus. They'll bicker over where to draw a line. They'll do so with a sort of snapshot understanding of rights in the back of their mind, but the debate's then all about the fetus, and there's very little attention given to the question of what is a right. And so I spent, I think, probably the bulk of my time talking about rights, because I think that if you have, it depends a great deal which conception of rights you're working with. If you're going to decide whether the embryo or the fetus has rights. Everybody seems to agree that the woman does in some way or another, but there's disagreement about the embryo or the fetus. And I think it makes a great difference whether you are talking about, in effect, what I think is a kind of religious conception of rights and a more Enlightenment era, original American individual rights theory. And I tried to give some content to the idea of the Enlightenment American view, and then applied it to the abortion question to make sense of why it's the fully mature woman who's clearly the possessor of an individual right to her life and her liberty and her pursuit of happiness, and that a fetus or an embryo, especially not an embryo, is simply not, because it's not an individual in the relevant respects. And I did some historical research on the concept of individual rights to get to that point, and that's, I think, maybe some of what we'll talk more about today, though we did talk about it briefly, especially in a question that you asked in that session.
I want to take a little bit of exception to the idea that everybody agrees that the woman has individual rights.
Well, that's why I said in one way or another.
Because, I mean, I think almost everybody would affirm the sentence, say yes to the sentence, women have rights. But on what I think of as the right view of rights, rights aren't the kinds of things that can conflict. And if you think of rights as any kind of moral claim or whatever, and you think they can conflict in all sorts of ways, then you can have a situation, which I think how most people think about it, where the mother has rights, on the other hand, the fetus has some rights, and maybe society has some rights in or at least some interests in regulating reproduction, and everyone has rights, and they all have to be adjudicated out. Whereas I think of rights as kind of absolutes. They apply contextually, and we can talk about the context, but the very nature of rights, as I understand them, is such that according to the fetus makes the mother absolutely rightless. And that, I think, is really essential to understanding abortion, if I'm right about that, because of what a right is precisely a principle about how separate individuals can interact and how their interaction should be regarded in the law.
And how they can do it without the necessity of conflict.
Right.
So if you're talking about a conflict of rights, you're using some other concept.
Right.
It's not really the concept of rights. The way I learned this from Harry Binswanger once, who's my old teacher in the Objectivist Graduate Center, it was rights are conflict resolving principles. So that's why you can't have a conflict of rights. I should say this is a big part of the reason why I'm actually interested in the abortion controversy. I'm not interested in it because of any personal connection I have to the topic of abortion, although I know people who've had them, and I very much am glad that they were able to, and want to see other people like them be able to. But I'm just kind of philosophically fascinated by the controversy because of the way that it intersects, where so many philosophical issues intersect with it, including the very important topic of the concept of individual rights.
So let's start. We've alluded to the idea of different conceptions of rights. And you've been doing this historical research. You had this very nice phrase in the talk that there's a certain view of rights on which rights are the shadows of duties. So can you sort of lay out, what you see as the different views historically of rights and that view, and what is the view that you want to contrast to that one? Yeah.
So that's the more what I take to be religious conception of rights. And hereby, when I say religious conception, I don't just mean that it's only religious people who have this view, though historically I think most of them were. Because there's many secular people, probably even people who are atheists, who still have this idea. In one way or another, they inherited it from that tradition, and there's a certain style of thinking that tradition is amenable to, that they also share. We could talk more about that later, but
You might think
It's
the ontological conception of rights is the right way to think about this.
yeah, and that is
Duties
in fact,
are the primary.
yeah. So deontological ethics is the ethics that we get from Immanuel Kant. Kant himself was sort of on the cusp of being a religious thinker and being a secular thinker. He's often regarded as an Enlightenment thinker, but at the same time, in the Critique of Pure Reason, he says he's happy he's able to limit reason in order to make room for faith. The views as follows about rights, and I think this is one that Kant more or less shares. It's that if you have a duty not to kill, then it's just a kind of logical implication of that. If you have that duty, somebody else has a right not to be killed. And you can plug in any other set of duties and corresponding rights. Sometimes this is described as a negative right, where you have a right not to have something done to you because somebody else has this duty. And it makes complete sense that this would be the view of rights that's associated with that older religious approach to morality, because, of course, in a religious conception of morality, duties are what you start with. They're what you get directly from some kind of divine commandment. Now, in Kant's case, he doesn't think it's quite like that. We have a long discussion about where he thinks we get duties from, but it's still a primary for him in an important way.
So I think we can separate it from religion per se, and just there's this idea that there are certain obligations you have. It's kind of a brute fact of ethics that there is a set of obligations that we have, and then a right is what somebody else has, as in effect a shadow is owed but from me as a shadow as you're putting it of my obligation. But that's what you're calling the negative conception of rights, or you're calling it the deontological or the religious conception.
Some people will often call it a negative.
But usually when I hear that phrase negative conception of rights or negative rights, it's contrasted with positive rights.
Right.
And a positive right is a right to something, a right to a basic income, a right to a decent standard of living, a right to an education, a right to health care. And usually you see positive and negative rights contrasted. But, I mean, I don't know how. Tell me about, if you're rejecting a negative conception of rights, or the objectivist view of rights is not a negative conception of rights, it's certainly not a positive conception of rights in the sense of that contrast. And if this contrast between this shadows of duty view and the, let's call it an objective view of rights, or an individualist view of rights, if this contrast is the fundamental contrast, then we'd expect these so-called positive rights to fall together with the duty shadows. And I'm not sure whether I think they do. Like, is the right to health care that some people think we have a shadow of a duty to be charitable or to provide other people with health care?
In fact, I think that is often the way that it's understood. Now, I think there are probably people who will try to put a different spin on it, but the fundamental there is still somebody has the duty to provide, and you have then the duty to receive,
or the right to receive.
Yes, the right to receive. And I just want to distinguish what I take to be the proper conception of rights here from both of those views, the what are traditionally regarded as negative and what are traditionally regarded as positive rights, because what I think is really distinctive that you start to see the glimmers of in the Enlightenment period, and it's not all fully worked out or made explicit or defined self-consciously, but you start to get the idea of that there's something morally good about an individual's own positive activity that needs to be protected, and whatever duty others have to not interfere derives from that positive, morally admirable activity that the rights bearer or the rights holder has. And so it's the other way around. If anything, it's the obligations that other people have to not interfere with rights are more the shadows of the moral rectitude and virtue of the activity that an individual with rights is pursuing and they need to be able to be protected to do it. And it's clearly what's at stake. That's clearly the view that Ayn Rand has. And at one point in her essay, Man's Rights, which appears in The Virtue of Selfishness, she talks about how rights, the traditional dichotomy between positive and negative is just false, because she says it's a moral sanction of a positive, which entails this, negative obligation on others' parts not to interfere.
Yeah, I mean, you might think that what's going on here is the so-called positive rights, the rights to something from someone, to a service, come proximally from the idea that you have a basic or a fundamental need for these things, and that whatever basic or fundamental needs you have are claims on others because others have a duty to be charitable or altruistic or something like that. But in another sense, you might say that the objectivist conception of rights comes from needs, in the sense that what you fundamentally need from others in a social context is the freedom to lead your own life.
But it's also a need that you have to do something else.
Yes, so it's a need for action, and it's a kind of action that is recognized as morally good and as the basis of getting together in society. What was interesting in your presentation, apart from the specifics of abortion, is the kind of historical claim about how this emerges. So could you say a little bit more about where you see it coming about? Is Locke really the beginning of this? How does he relate to earlier thinkers?
So I'll start by saying, when I started investigating this, I had the pretty good hunch based on a lot of other learning that Locke was pretty important here, but I also knew that there was a long history stretching before him, and I didn't want to just take it sort of as dogma that it was Locke who figured it all out. And I'll also say that it's not like he was Athena born from the head of Zeus with this whole theory worked out that was radically different in every possible way from all of his predecessors. There's continuities of all different kinds between him and his predecessors, and so there's a way in which he gives birth to this theory, but it's a bigger break than others had in the past. It's not night and day difference. And what I think is especially unique in his case is that whereas these previous thinkers, people like Grotius and Suarez and Vittoria and even Occam, all had some conception or other of rights of the kind that we were just talking about, where it's a permission because it's a reflection of someone else's duty. Locke really does have that kind of positive component that I was talking about before. That he's got this idea that there's something about the law of nature, is the way he usually puts it, gives us reason to preserve ourselves, and it's not just in a Hobbesian way, that he sees there as being something virtuous and admirable in industry and in rationality. And I mean, I think you especially see this coming out in his account of the right to revolution. This is where he really is radical and revolutionary. Every major political theorist that I can think of before him, in one way or another, defended the idea that when push comes to shove in a case like that, the sovereign has the right to quell rebellion. And Locke says, no, when the sovereign is a tyrant, he loses his rights and you can rebel against him. And that's, of course, the biggest impact that he has on the American Constitution and the Revolution.
Declaration in particular.
Yeah. The divine right of kings is his major target, and was the major kind of right that people talked about in the period when Christian philosophy dominated.
Yeah, so I want to get clearer on what this positive conception of rights is, or what we should call it, the one that you're endorsing, and I guess the one that I agree with. But if what we're doing is claiming that this is the fundamental divide in views about rights, or when things claimed as rights, right? There's two conceptions of rights, and when something's claimed as a right, we shouldn't be thinking, is it a positive right or a negative right, or this is right or that is right? There's this other distinction that's the fundamental distinction. Then I think the claim is that there are these ersatz rights, these bullshit rights, these rights that come from a false moral theory, and under your heading, I think we would say that the divine right of kings, the right of a fetus to be carried to term, but also the right to education, health care, a living wage, etc., are all examples of this other kind of right that we want to reject. And the quote American or Lockean or objectivist, whatever it is, the sense of rights is the other kind of right, the good right that we don't want to reject, if that's what our view is. And then what is the fundamental division between those types of rights? Well, one is their individual rights in the way that the others aren't, or how are you seeing their rights that come from a sanction on a positive? They're the real rights. What's the kind of fundamental? They're objective rights?
Well, I think the individual rights is a concept that I think only gets named retrospectively after a bunch of people have proposed that there are rights you have as a member of a collective or something like that.
And then we come back and say the rights that we were concerned with are the individual rights, not your right as a carpenter or as a member of this or that religion or this or that gender or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, Locke doesn't use the phrase individual rights. I don't think the phrase ends up getting used, and I did some word searches on this. I don't think it ends up getting used until the very late 18th century, early 19th century, and they're mostly, the ones I could find at least, were mostly in American documents. But even then, it's sort of a passing phrase, like the rights of the individual.
I mean, you'd expect it to be something that you'd see cropping up in the reactions against socialism as a movement.
I think that when it gets formalized, it's more of a 19th century concept in reaction to socialism, and then that tradition probably is searching for its roots and finding them in Locke, who wasn't opposed to who wasn't dealing with that same kind of overt collectivism, but there were elements of it. I mean, like Hobbes' Leviathan. The whole concept of a Leviathan is like a great sea creature that comes out of the sea, and it's his analogy for the sovereign whose power is formed out of the masses coming together as a whole. So, but it's not yet conceptualized as something like collectivism. That only comes later in the 19th century. So I don't think that the individual rights versus collectivist rights is the distinction that I am that we've just been talking about for the last 15 minutes, though I think retrospectively you can use it to describe that. So I don't have a good word for the difference between the kind of Lockean Enlightenment view of rights and the pre-Enlightenment religious tradition. Maybe you could just call it secular versus religious conceptions. But then, in fact, I think it becomes coextensive with the idea of individual rights once the collectivism becomes the more distinctive opposition. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I don't have we're having this conversation, in real time live. We haven't scripted it or worked it out. I'm a little concerned with, I don't like the idea of calling it secular versus religious, because there are plenty of things that I want to say are on the side I disagree with of this divide that are held by people who are professedly secular. And then you could say, well, but really it has religious roots, or it's mystical, or it doesn't have any. And my sense is, sure, one can argue that, and that's probably true. I think most of the ideas I don't like, or very many of them, have covertly mystical or religious origins. But I want a way to describe the view that's sort of neutral of that, and then you can make the case. Deontological ethics is ultimately mystical, but it's not, professedly mystical. And maybe that's.
Maybe one way to describe it would be teleological account of rights as opposed to a deontological. Though that then has the danger of being confused with consequentialist and utilitarian views.
And there are plenty of people who think of themselves as believing in individual rights, but who think that fetuses have them, right? Now, it might be that they're wrong and the fetuses aren't individuals, but there's nothing obvious. Individual contrasts with collective, and so it's not obviously collective. So is it that it's a shadow of a duty? Well, if we want to understand the shadow of a duty more broadly to include the positive rights too, so it's not just negative versus positive, what we're saying is that the rights are claims that one person has against his fellows that follow from ethics, the ethical obligations on his fellows. And what those ethical obligations are going to be is going to be very different depending on what code of ethics is true. And so then you might think, well, all views of rights are that.
Right.
Your rights are the what you can claim against other people, what you can claim should be defended, and against other people, or what you can claim from other people.
What's unique here is that
ethics,
the moral obligation that's central is the obligation of the same person the right protects, as opposed to the other view where it's split.
Well, there is an obligation to other people too, right? Like, so your right to life does impose an obligation on me not to kill you. So it's there's the positive and negative. The claim is that it's a sanction of a positive. It's a sanction, but not a command of to use Rand's formulation, it's a sanction, but not a command of a positive, which sanction imposes a negative obligation on other people not to violate it. And so the idea is it's based on a recognition of a type of activity that is good or right for people, on the idea that that type of activity can only be engaged in by people as individuals, and that it's foundational to that the propriety of their engaging in that activity is sort of foundational to society in such a manner that no one else in society may infringe upon the sphere of action that's required for them to act that way.
Here's another dimension of this that maybe enriches the topic a bit, and that's that if you understand Rand's view of what that moral obligation we're talking about is, the virtue of selfishness, the idea that there's virtue in pursuing your own rational self-interest. Distinctive to her view here as well is that your self-interest, your rational self-interest is not just do anything you want to, whatever you feel like. It's what does your mind tell you is necessary for the survival of the kind of being that you are, which is a rational being which survives by thinking and production. And she has the view that your own self-interest requires not interfering with other people. So it's not just that it's good for you not to kill people because they have a right. It's good for you not to kill people because your own life benefits from not pursuing that kind of activity. And so in a way, it's your obligation derives from your own rights. Right. And what makes them a right to you.
Or rather, from what makes them a right to you. I mean, I have a paper called Selfish Regard for the Rights of Others in a book I co-edited with Robert Mayu. The book's called Foundations of a Free Society, and people can find it online. So I definitely have that view that there is a self-interested reason for respecting rights. But I want to understand not just sort of Rand's view, but what if there's a genus of view here, of which her view is one, and maybe it's the best or most consistent version of this, we might think. But I want to understand the kind of genus where someone might not hold that thing that we just said, that there's a selfish reason to respect them, but we can identify there's a kind of type of view that you're claiming is in the American founding, is in Locke. I'm inclined to think these things too, isn't in the earlier history of talk about rights, although maybe is gradually emerging from it. What is the essence of this difference?
I should say that a lot of what we were just talking about is also in Locke. That is, unlike Hobbes, he is pretty clearly on the side of there's a harmony of interests between people. This is like the major exception that he takes with Hobbes' view of the state of nature. He thinks that we are all better served if we abide by the principles of what he regards as morality. That is, our own interests are better furthered. Now, part of that is for his religious reasons, but I don't think all of it is.
Yeah, I mean, Hobbes, in a certain way, thinks that too. If we could trust one another and get out of a state of war, I mean, one can overstress. I mean, Hobbes thinks that people write. I don't want Hobbes to too much be the heavy here, even though I think his view of human nature and morality is a lot wrong with it. If you think about the passions, what people want in his view, right? They want to live. They want commodious living and the luxuries necessary for commodious living, and they hope by their labor to achieve them. And the problem with the state of war of all against all that we inevitably get into without a government is that it prevents us from fulfilling those hopes because we can't trust each other. And Locke, too, thinks that it's possible, indeed all too common, for people to get into a state of war with one another, right? People often are living in the state of war with one another. It's just that Locke doesn't think that without a government, one is necessarily in a state of war,
right,
and that the principles of justice are co-evolved with the coming to be of a government, which therefore is necessarily all-powerful. Rather, he thinks there are principles inherent in nature of how we should act towards one another that involve, endeavoring by our industry to get the things needed for commodious living, to use Hobbes' term, that there's people who are not at a state of war with one another, even in a state of nature, and that it's possible to kind of capitalize on that to create a government that preserves that state of peace and extends it, and makes it less likely to fall into a state of war. So even Hobbes, I think, has this idea of a positive way of acting, which involves kind of earning your way,
yeah,
and producing things.
And I actually think I should say, by the way, that's one of the things I have in mind, or I had in mind when I was saying I don't think that Locke is just giving birth to everything on his own here. Like, I think some of this he actually gets from Hobbes. And I think it's, in spite of all of his problems, the fact that Hobbes is so overtly secular in a way that was controversial for his day was part of what got the ball rolling. And the factors you were just mentioning, that he has this conception of a law of nature that's completely independent of anything divine. I think he pays lip service to religion, but he's the most heretical of his period in this regard, and this is what gets him in trouble. The point he even gets silenced, basically, and promises never to write about political theory again. And I mean, I think that was important historically and laid some groundwork for Locke.
No, that's it. But I mean, part of the one of the things that's interesting in Hobbes is this. There's something individualistic about it, in that you think of like a particular person. Maybe he's got his own friends or little clan or whatever, and now he's in a war of all against all with everybody else, and he wants to get out of it. And if only he could get out of it, how is he going to get out of it? If he could get out of it, then he can kind of, shift for himself, or what there's this phrase that you get. I think it's shift for oneself around the time of the American founding document. I'm not sure why I'm pretty sure it's the verb shift, but basically you're going to till a field and you're going to do stuff and you'll provide for yourself in effect. So there's this idea of people as providers for themselves. If we get society right, people are able to be providers for themselves. And let's get society right in order to do it. That is definitely behind Locke. I think you find elements of it behind other Enlightenment views. Locke is saying you have a right to that, whereas Hobbes doesn't think you do. Right? Is that, though, not around earlier? Like if we look at
Well, it's
medieval
even in
thought.
Hobbes to an extent, but in a weird way.
No, I'm
because
saying it is in Hobbes. Yeah.
No, but not just, but even the right language is in Hobbes. He speaks of it in kind of a positive, descriptive, not normative way. That there's a right of nature that consists of pursuit of your self-interest unimpeded, and that's what then leads you into conflict. But
Because you have a right to all things.
Right.
And then in Locke, you get this distinction between liberty and license,
Right.
which you have back in Plato and elsewhere, but you get it applied in this kind of a context where you have a right that extends so far, but not into other people's business, so to speak.
Right.
So with Locke and with his drawing of that distinction between liberty and license, I think you get this idea of spheres. I don't know who started you. I mean, Rand doesn't talk of spheres exactly.
Might be a Nozick.
Yeah, it's kind of Nozickian, but this idea of a kind of you have a area of action that is sanctioned, a scope of action that is sanctioned. Do we not though see that in earlier talk of rights? So we don't. I don't think we have an idea of a divine right of kings. I guess the king has a large scope of action, but we don't have that idea of the individual people each shifting for themselves and it being right for them to do that. Is that not something we find in Grotius and Suarez and any of these people? I don't know. I'm not.
The closest that I know of is in that same tradition where rights derive from these duties.
Mm-hmm.
You'll talk about they'll be talking about acting within your rights if you're not violating your duty.
Mm-hmm.
And there it's equivalent with you're acting as you are permitted to act.
It's
a space of permission. You're permitted, but you are not. It's like the line in Fiddler on the Roof, Rabbi. What do you think of dancing at a party like this? Well, it's not exactly forbidden. But that still doesn't come dressed in overtly positively moral clothes.
So the idea is you have a duty and maybe you have some scope in the carrying out of that duty. And therefore you have a right to do X or Y or Z because X or Y or Z are different ways of your carrying out your duty, and maybe it's up to you to pick which way or to act within your duty in any of the ways in which you might. But that's not valorized, it's just kind of accepted.
That's the sense I get. Yeah.
I mean, I don't really, I know the kind of ancient thinkers, but I don't know the medieval thinkers on this. And so interesting to see how does that idea develop and where does it develop?
One other thing we haven't talked about yet about Locke that I think is really important is his conception of self-ownership. Mm-hmm. Which he's really overt about in the second treatise, mostly in his discussion of property rights. But one thing to remember is when Locke talks about property rights, he's not just talking about land and physical objects, he's talking about life, liberty, and estates. So the whole ball of wax. And he, of course, famously has this doctrine that you take, that the earth is given to us in common, but you take things out of the common and make them your own through your labor. But central to his argument there is you own your person and you own the labor that you engage in because of your ownership of your person, and that's why you then own the property that you take out of the state of nature. And what he says about self-ownership is like what we were talking about before. It's morally imbued. It's a positive. It's very different from previous conceptions that are sometimes compared to his view. So, for example, there's this guy I was reading named Brian Tierney, and he has this paper from 2005, Historical Roots of Modern Rights Before Locke and After. Mm-hmm. And when I found this paper, it's like, this is exactly what I want if I'm trying to understand this topic, because what he's going to argue for is, no, Locke is not as original and revolutionary as people think, and he this is a steelman kind of argument against the kind of doctrinal view about Locke. And so I read the paper, and he does indeed point to a lot of interesting continuities with previous traditions, some of which we've talked about, and one of them is on the topic of self-ownership, because he knows that this is the aspect of Locke's view that people are most likely to cite in defense of what makes him special. And so what he does is he goes back through various late medieval figures who have views of something like self-ownership. Now, usually, interestingly, it's interesting. It's already put in terms. Mostly, it's in terms of self-mastery. And when you dig down, and so he's saying, so this is not so new to Locke. These other people have this view of free will, and by your free will, you master yourself. That sounds kind of similar. But at the end of the day, when you drill down to what they're really talking about, it's the kind of mastery you have over yourself if you want to engage in self-abnegation, if you want to quell all the evil things inside of you. That's quite consistent with the whole
self-mastery generally means. I mean,
Yeah.
to master something and to own it are not the same thing.
Well, that's my point.
You might think you get to own certain things by having mastered them, but what it means to master something and what it means to own it, I think, are quite
Well, that's
different
my
things.
point. That's my point. But Tierney thinks they're kind of the same, and cites it as an example of why Locke is not so special.
I take it that what it is to master something is to have acquired control over it, or something like that. And what it is to
that's the
own
commonality.
something is no, because you might have acquired control over something you don't own.
Fair enough.
Ownership is like, you ought to have control over it or something like that.
But they do both have some connection to control.
Yeah.
And
I
so,
think that one's descriptive and one's normative. One's what you in fact have control over, and the other is what you ought to have control over, whether you do
yeah.
or not.
And that's important. That's an important difference. And there's also the fact that you just don't have anything like this pro self-abnegation ascetic view in Locke that I can find.
But I see that as a bigger distinction, though, because you might not be an ascetic and think, a lot of people don't have self-mastery. They're, running wild or whatever. They can't control themselves. I don't think they should be ascetic, but they shouldn't be like this. They need more discipline or whatever. Somebody could be saying, self-mastery is a good kind of thing. And that's quite a different thing from saying they have a right not to be mastered by others, or they own themselves. Maybe you can see how it might follow, like if you ought to master yourself, then nobody else ought to master you because they'll preclude you from mastering yourself. If you're a slave, literally, that's someone who's mastered by someone else who's now controlling him. You are denied maybe opportunities to run your life, and so you can't master it. So I guess if you're encouraging self-mastery as a moral positive, and you're encouraging it existentially, not just in a stoic way where you have to bear whatever bad happens to you, don't let it get to you, then you would think that somebody else is being your master in a slave context, makes it such that you can't achieve self-mastery, and so deprives you of that. So there's a kind of route from being pro self-mastery to being pro self-ownership, I guess.
Yeah, but I don't think it's... If you're talking about the self-mastery as opposed to being mastered by others, you could do that, sure. I don't think that's what any of these people do.
There also is self-ownership. I mean, the right. So this is a kind of central concept in Locke. It's also a central concept in any number of libertarian thinkers. I think Rothbard uses it somewhat. Hoppe definitely talks about it, right? Your property and yourself and so forth, and as does Locke. And they're getting it from Locke. I've always thought of that as not the right way to think about rights. It's maybe a metaphor, and it's kind of okay in its context.
I think it's not the fundamental, but it's a telling metaphor that Locke finds it so appealing. Like it's like I said, I don't think he has fully properly conceptualized what he's kind of bumped into here. But the fact that he's using this metaphor rather than something else, it tells you something about where his heart is, in effect. And let me add one more thing to that, which is that there's another scholar I was reading who's a critic of this Tierney guy, S. Adam Seagrave, and he's more recent and has a book I haven't read the book yet. I read a bunch of articles by him, Foundations of Natural Morality, which is about Locke's view and what he thinks makes Locke distinctive. And one of the things he also does, which I think he probably overplays a bit, but there's still something there that's important, is the extent to which the idea of workmanship is, I mean, famously in Locke's theory of property, but it's not just there. Like it's through a lot of his other work. And I mean, to the point where, like, think about Locke's critique of innate ideas. He talks about the workmanship of the understanding. It's not enough. You don't just start with knowledge that God gives you. You have to do work on your own experience to earn that knowledge, in just the way that he thinks you earn your property. Seagrave even talks about the stuff that Locke says about self-consciousness and personal identity, and suggests that there's work of consciousness involved in maintaining your the identity of your consciousness over time. And that's the part where I think he's maybe overplaying it a bit. But the point is just that the labor involved in ownership for Locke is not an idle idea of his. It's something that is a current running through a lot of his thought, and that I think is important here.
Well, that's interesting, because that connects to the idea that if there's something new in Locke, it's a conception of objectivity of rights. And it's the way I think of objectivity. I mean, I've made a big stress in epistemology that objectivity is about thinking of knowledge as work. And
that's what I was thinking of when I saw this.
That there's something to do in all the fields where there's objectivity. Objectivity is about doing that work conscientiously. And you know, Rand talks about capitalism. She defines it as a system based on individual rights, and she thinks of that as being the first social system that's objective, that recognizes goodness as objective, which means, in effect, that goodness isn't revealed or found passively in nature, nor is it just come up with by people, but is a result of a kind of, you know, proper processing that's responsive to and tracking facts, but not already there in those facts apart from the work independently.
And there's a lot in Locke's theory of property that is so close to Rand's view of the objectivity of value. Like, and this isn't new to me. This is like Harry Binswanger's made this point in his talks on Locke, that, and I think Adam Mossoff's talk about it too. That I mean, when Locke talks about the value that we're given in nature before we do any work on it, he always puts it in terms of 99% of the value is added by our work, and only 1% is kind of intrinsic.
I think it's 99.9.
It might even be that. I mean, he says different things in different places, and the objectivist critique of that would be, no, it's 100% is because of our work and because of the consciousness that we apply to it.
Even
but
I think that's not exactly the right thing to say back, but that's another issue. But yeah, there's the relationship isn't how many parts of it, but something more like matter to form or something.
Yeah, and he describes it as a wasteland, as
well. Let's
worthless.
Just be concrete about this, because we're very much in the weeds of Locke. But the example he gives is there's, you know, uncultivated land, and there are people living on it who don't know. There's no concept of ownership of land yet, and there are things growing wild on the land. The land is owned by all in common because God gave it to humanity in common, and everybody's just wandering around picking berries or hunting things on the land or whatever, and they're able to feed themselves on it. But if you think of like how much land it would take for you to feed yourself wandering over it for a day, you know, it's whatever, how many ever hectares of land or something to get enough berries to feed yourself. Now, if you take a patch and clear it and start growing those berry bushes on it, you're going to be able to get the amount that you need to feed yourself on, let's say, 1/100th of the amount of land that you'd have to wander over to find that many berries alone. And so that if you think of all the other people, well, they have that other 99/100ths of that amount of land that they can keep wandering over. So in effect, you've given that much land to them by taking off this bit and making it your own, on which you're now producing these more berries. And then he, somehow he gets up to an even higher figure than 99. But the idea is you make the land more productive, and therefore acquire it to yourself. And so that's where we get these ideas of figures like, how much percent of the value within the land itself versus due to people's actions on it. You find the passage? Or?
Yeah, there's this is in chapter 5 of Second Treatise. I think it will be but a very modest computation to say that of the products of the earth useful to the life of man, 9/10 are the effects of labor. Nay, if we will rightly estimate things as they come to our use and cast up the several expenses about them, what in them is purely owing to nature and what to labor, we shall find that in most of them 99/100ths are wholly to be put on the account of labor. And then a little bit later he says, so little that even amongst us land that is left wholly to nature, that hath no improvement of pastures, tillage, or planting, is called, as indeed it is, waste, and we shall find the benefit of it amount to little more than nothing. So, one other thing I want to talk about that will relate us back to the issue of the positive versus negative rights controversy, and how the objectivist view is a completely different alternative. I would say Locke's is too, for the reasons that we've just been discussing. Is that so? The kind of modern categorization of positive versus negative rights or freedom mostly comes out of Isaiah Berlin,
yeah.
His paper Two Concepts of Liberty, and there
it's negative liberty versus positive liberty primarily. Yeah,
they often get equated. I actually think this is a very interesting paper to read. There's a lot of good history in this paper, and I even feel like his heart is in the right place on a lot of issues, and I recommend people read it. But the way that he understands positive liberty is especially interesting because it's not as simple as it's often represented as you've got a positive right to something if you've got a right to somebody else's goods or something like that. He's putting it in. I mean, he's surveying thinkers like Rousseau and Hegel and Kant, and how they have what he calls this positive conception of liberty. And so these aren't people who are at least well known for their welfare state concepts, even though they might in certain ways be amenable to it. What they're known for is a view of liberty where there is a real self that you have that is enslaved to some terrible inclinations or urges. And what it is to maintain your positive liberty, or to gain your positive liberty, is to quash all these terrible urges in yourself. To do that sometimes, maybe often, requires merging yourself with other people for the sake of a higher cause. That's like Rousseau's idea of the general will. Certainly, that you see that in Hegel. And so, what's interesting
in Plato,
yeah, and that's what's interesting about it, because even though it's offered as a new idea, as opposed to the old-fashioned idea of negative rights, it's actually really everything old is new again, because it's the idea of you're a slave if these urges are in control of you, and you're not free until you overcome them and merge with the greater whole. That's that same idea of self-mastery as being able to have self-negation, self-abnegation, which is the older view, the older religious view of
and of course, again, it's the view in Plato. So Plato thinks of democracy, which is a bad form of government in his view, right, as the view that prizes liberty above all other things. And so in a democratic society, even the animals seem free and uppity. In effect, everything is uppity in a democratic society. It feels like it's equal with its betters and their etc. But it's pretty clear from Plato's view that he doesn't think this is the right conception of liberty. Like, to hear a Democrat talk, they'll go on about liberty and so forth, but their view of even liberty is wrong. There's a positive value to liberty, but the kind of liberty that the Democrat and the democratic person wants is a liberty where a liberty that comes from a kind of egalitarianism that ends up enslaving the best people to the worst, and enslaving the best in people to the worst in them, to their many manifold desires and so forth, which are put on a par with reason, which knows better. True liberty would be involved in making the part of you that is truly human master of the part of you that has many and sundry and awful desires, and it's a type of slavery to be.
I think he's the same thing with Stoics, right? So,
but Plato they also use image, but Plato, it's the Stoics are harder because there were so many of them, and it's not clear. at least their emphases are all different. Plato is sort of one guy.
So one more thing we should be sure to talk about today is an issue that came up in conversation after the talk.
Oh, I know what you could. You want
to do something else first?
Yeah, just the one question is like, what's the right way to think about all of this? And part of what we want to think about is like, where does the idea of liberty come from? Where does the idea of rights come from in the first place? How are they related? And one thing that this example brings up is how much the contrast between freedom and slavery is important to kind of understand where does this concept get formed. I think it was known, very early on that there's something really bad about being a slave. Even people who think some people, deserve to be slaves or their nature is such that they can't be anything better than slaves or whatever, still think that then you don't want to be that kind of person. Maybe if it so happens that you are the kind of person who's only fit to be a slave, then you're best off being a slave. But I'm not that kind of person, and I'm glad I'm not, right? Would think Plato or Aristotle, who in their different ways think that there are people just fit for this. So there's this idea that there's something awful, bad. You don't want to be in that situation. It would be horrible to be in that situation. It's unbefitting for a human being to be in that situation, or at least a full-fledged human being, of the situation of a slave, and you want the opposite of that. And you want the opposite of that kind of internally, so you don't want to be enslaved to your baser appetites or something like that, but you also want the opposite of that in your relations with other people. And a lot of, I think, thinking in ethics and in politics is like trying to really understand that. Well, what is the opposite of it? And what other things that aren't literal slavery are akin to slavery and having the same thing wrong with it, is like addiction or maybe even feeling emotions, something like being enslaved to something, and so we want it's bad in the same way. What other things might be, and what is the ideal that we understand that slavery is the harshest contrast to?
I'm really glad that you stopped me from going to the next point, because this reminded me of something I wanted to say about Locke still, because Locke has a lot to say about slavery, and it's been controversial. The interpretation of what he says is controversial, and I've now read some of the dueling scholarly debates. So he has a chapter in the second treatise about slavery. In fact, this is
the second treatise of civil government, which is also where the chapter on property is that we just discussed.
Right. He has a chapter, and it's what is it? Chapter. I think it's right. Yeah, right before the one on property. 4 or 5. Chapter 4 of slavery.
Property, yeah.
And so it's clear that he's opposing slavery and liberty, for one thing. In fact, the first treatise on civil government, which is the one against the divine right of kings, opens, the very first paragraph of it talks about what's so terrible about slavery. And part of his concern, obviously, in this period of English politics is that he thinks the king, the one who gets overthrown, is endeavoring to put his people into slavery.
It should be said that this is an old concern. So if you go back to Aristotle, if you go back to the Greeks separating themselves from the Persians and thinking that they're better than the Persians, part of why they're better is that the Persian king, the great king, rules everyone like a master rules his slaves. We don't do that in Greece. We're not like that. We have slaves, but we don't treat everyone like they're slaves. And part of a central theme in Aristotle's politics, and this is worth mentioning because so much from Aristotle's politics is just structuring Locke's politics, just what topics are discussed and so forth, like why is there a section on the family and so forth, has to do with the different types of rule. And is there one thing rule and everyone who rules someone else rules them in the same way? And so the difference between a father and husband who's head of a household and a slave master who's running a large plantation or a larger plantation and the guy who's running a city, it's just how many people you've got under your thumb or how many people you're governing or ruling, or rather are there different relationships of ruler to ruled that work in essentially different ways and should work in essentially different ways, such that the relationship of husband to wife, father to child, master to slave, governor to governed are different relationships and should be different. And Aristotle is saying, even though he thinks these are all valid relationships, that they're different relationships. And Locke is, I think, doing the same type of thing, although much more radically, because he, I think, rejects the relationship of master to slave entirely. There's a issue of what to do if you imprison someone in war or something.
Well, that's the thing. So what he says in the chapter on slavery is the only thing that could justify slavery is if you go to war, the other country's an aggressor, you capture their troops in battle, then you can make them slaves. And what's controversial about this is the obvious thing, perhaps for the period, is this is a period where the slave trade is flourishing. Not only that, but there are ways in which, at least in his earlier period, Locke is indirectly involved with the slave trade. Because
in two respects, he had stock was paid for a certain position in stock of a company that was trading in slaves, and he was a secretary involved in the drafting of the Constitution of the Carolinas, which it's not clear how much in the Constitution of the Carolinas, to what extent is he just the draftsman and to what extent are these his ideas. But anyway, there's some slavery stuff in that Constitution.
Yes, so that's...
Although less than you might think, given what became of the Carolinas.
Yes. But so that's the seed of the controversy here, which is that there's a whole contingent of scholars who say, well, in this chapter, Locke is just trying to rationalize and justify the slave trade that exists, especially since he's already involved in it. After all, one could argue, or he could have argued, though they never say that he does, that these various African slaves were captured in war by various African tribes that we were at war with, etc. Of course, that's not even then a very good justification for it, because of course they have children who are not themselves belligerents in the war.
And Locke is explicit on that.
He's explicit in the first treatise about how
and
slavery and authority do not descend by lineage. That's the whole idea about opposing the divine right of kings. So is Locke here, is he a hypocrite? Is he trying to rationalize? Does he not really oppose slavery? Well, the interesting thing that I discovered, and I think I had read this article sometime before and forgotten about it, but there was this very interesting piece by a philosopher, Holly Brewer. She wrote it in the magazine that's called Eon. Basically taking apart the historical narrative that usually goes into that interpretation, because while it's true that Locke had these kind of indirect connections to the slave trade, most of them were in virtue of the Charles II's expansion of the slave trade under his reign. Locke is known to become a critic of Charles II, in part because he thinks he's trying to make the English his own slaves. And what this very interesting article talks about is how, at the same time that he's coming to political consciousness against Charles II, he also begins to divest all of his involvement in the slave trade. And there are even documents that people have found of his kind of private notes talking about how the slave trade should be abolished. And so, he's clearly not a radical on this subject. He's not advocate. He's not outspoken about it like the later abolitionists are. But it's pretty hard to argue that he's pro.
I mean, but how much more outspoken can you be than Chapter 4 of the treatise against slavery?
The most they can say is that he's a hypocrite. Is really good. And my point is that it's not even clear that that's true.
And what was surprising to me about the Carolinas Constitution is how much it read as tolerationist rather than this being something really baked into the structure. It wasn't setting up it's definitely there, but it seems like it's there in the most minimal way it could be given what was happening, and in such a way that it's excisable, which was surprising to me. I would expect the Constitution of what the Carolinas became. Now, for example, if you read Confederate secession papers, that we're building a slave society with two classes of people based on, it's just, you couldn't be more explicit that this is a founding principle of the thing. What you get in the Carolina constitutions is, in effect, everybody's going to be treated equally, but with the exception of people brought in a certain situation. I forget exactly what it was, but it was, it had to do with whether people brought Negro servants in, as they phrased it, or I forget how they put it, but it was.
And I should mention also, part of the reason I think this is important is because why his position on this issue is important is because it goes hand in hand with the point I was making before about the right to revolution, that if you really are convinced of your own self-ownership and object morally to someone else's mastery over you, then that is going to be the reaction of a person of self-esteem.
Right.
So, like, we have the right to overthrow these people who are endeavoring to enslave us, as opposed to, for example, prominently, the Stoics, who talked about self-mastery, but didn't have objections to the institution of slavery per se.
Some of them did, I think so.
Not even Epictetus, who was a former slave. And certainly not the Christians who are sometimes invoked as the leadership of the abolitionist movement. I mean, there were Christians who were leaders of the abolitionist movement. But like, if you go back to St. Augustine, I mentioned in my talk, like, he explicitly justifies slavery as a punishment for our sinful nature. So there's a case, it was very clear-cut. You don't think this person has any positive moral worth by their nature or by their own
because indeed no one does.
choice, because nobody does, and so they don't have the right to even be free from being enslaved. It's
and the other
clear-cut.
When you mentioned the right to revolution, the other interesting thing about Locke in this is he considers the state of slavery not a state of nature, but a state of war persisting between the people. So if you enslave someone, maybe you have the right to do it because they put themselves into a war with you, and you think the war can't be ended, so you're just like kind of continuing the war with them in your house, where you're fighting with them and getting them to do your bidding. But there's the issue of who started the state of war and who's right in it or not, but you're still existing in a state of war with them. There's no idea that there's some kind of peaceable, rightful, stable condition where some people are under the subjugation of others. And that's part of why it can't pass down through generations, but it's even within the people. It's as though the fight between you never ended, but you got the upper hand, so you're kind of calling the shots for now. I mean, that's what the condition of slavery is, and there are cases where it's okay to keep doing that, presumably because you can't hope for any kind of peace.
So I still want to go to the point that we were going to go to, but there's a question, so I think we should interrupt ourselves.
What do people find insufficient about whatever rights theory they agree with, that they're the social contract theory, with this idea that you have to give up some of your rights, or we agree to give up some of our rights so that we can maintain a kind of social order or something like that? What do they find insufficient about their idea of rights, and how close is the relationship between social contract theory and these idea of rights as entitlements as opposed to rights as a freedom of action?
So when you say why do they find it insufficient? Who's the they you're talking about?
Just like whoever supports social contract theory, why do they feel the need to invoke that as opposed to just invoking purely just the concept of rights in terms of how to manage a society?
Well, for some of them, the social, and this is not true of all of them, but for some of them, the social contract kind of thought experiment is the mechanism for figuring out what your rights are supposed to be. This is certainly true in Rawls. I don't think it's true in everybody, but you have a right to what you would have agreed to in a social contract. But now, of the ones who don't think that, it's not quite true that they think rights are insufficient. Someone like Hobbes does talk about rights that are natural, that pre-exist the social contract, but he thinks that it's what we talked about before. I don't know if you were here when we were. Everybody has a right to their own self-preservation, and they conflict with each other. And so, to stop the state of war that comes from the conflict of all these rights, we need a social contract for there to be peace.
And then that social contract defines a more limited set of rights
Yeah.
that everybody has. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but in the case of Hobbes, I guess that's not really a political right that he's talking about, like you're saying. It's more like a more
True.
basic kind of like ethical.
Right, and political rights, but even anything that's a justice, right, that would fall under the broader heading of justice, comes out of the contract, and there is no justice prior to the social contract. There's no mine and thine distinct prior to the social contract for Hobbes. For Locke, I think a social contract is how a government comes about, but that contract comes about to create a government in a context of already existing rights, and it's there are new specific rights that derive from the contract, but the contract is the forming of a rights and obligations that come from your specific role in this contract, but the contract is based on pre-existing rights and formed in order to help secure or maintain them better. So in a state of nature, you have, for example, the right to act as your own enforcer anytime you see natural rights being violated. When you enter into a state of civil society through the natural contract, you forfeit that right to, in effect, dispense vigilante justice all on your own, and delegate it to mechanisms within the state. I think that is, I wouldn't quite describe it as forfeiting rights, but I think that is essentially correct.
Yeah.
I agree with Locke on that view, although even there I don't think I quite agree with the way he thinks we have that right to begin with. I think even on the details I would quibble there, but there's something right about that. But the more modern view is, again, this Rawlsian view, and for Rawls, where justice is in effect the terms of a social contract, which social contract people didn't ever literally sign, but you can
What you would have signed if you were
come
being
up with
rational.
its terms by envisioning a certain thought experiment whereby you know nothing about yourself and you're deliberating with a whole bunch of other people who know nothing about themselves on the terms about how a society in which they will all exist should be conducted.
You can interpret
And
Kant this way too.
what you would agree to is a certain scheme of rights and obligations and ways of distributing things. And Rawls thinks he knows what you, who isn't you in this situation, would agree to, because everybody would agree to the same things, and he can kind of work it out, and then those are your rights. And maybe there are some... so in that sense, rights comes out of the contract. They're not pre-existing the contract, but they're coming out of an idealized contract, not an actual one. The contract that, in effect, our noumenal selves would agree with everybody else's noumenal selves to use
Rousseau and Kant are both on the same order as that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Rawls is just...
Warmed over Kant.
yeah. I mean, I think he thinks he is. I don't think he...
Oh, explicitly.
I think
He
a
doesn't
lot
say
of...
he's warmed over, but he
I think
he
a
draws
lot of
explicit,
people have
inspiration.
attributed to Rawls a lot more originality and genius than Rawls claims himself to have. I think he just sees himself as, presenting...
That's
some
very
contribution.
Rawlsian of him.
Yeah, he's modest.
He didn't deserve his philosophy.
So I thought my understanding was like objectivism was sort of not aligned with just like any kind of like social contract theory, and is more like that you're just delegating your rights in the consent of the governed. So you're saying that's sort of like that is kind of like a social contract in the way that Locke is saying.
Well, it depends on what one means by social contract theory of what, like of government. There's a sense in which there's an agreement between a consent of the citizenry, I think, is needed for a government to exist. I don't think this is let me shift to bibliographic on this. I think the best thing written on this is there's a piece by Ankar Gate
On Nozick?
on Rand on Nozick
Yeah.
in the same book I recommended earlier that Robert Mayu and I edited. I forget exactly what it's called, but something like Rand and Nozick on rights.
Yeah. It's a very good
Which
paper.
I think is good on this. I don't think Rand uses the terminology of social contract much, and it's a kind of metaphor or extended usage. It's not like a bit of technical terminology in objectivism or a kind of argumentative move in objectivism in the way it is in other philosophies. Locke himself, who I think is the closest to, who she's closest to, does talk about social contracts and thinks that it's non-metaphorical. He thinks for every society you can figure out, like when it happened more or less and what it is. And he thinks it's just a matter of historical fact. I think there is a sense in which that's true if you understand contract widely enough, but it's a very extended use of contract.
There is one subtle-ish way in which Rand sort of uses language associated with the social contract when she talks about rights, and that's when she talks about rights as conditions of existence required by man's nature for his proper survival. And she often talks about that in the context of, if you're going to live in society, these are the conditions that you expect and demand to be able to live as freely from other people's interference. If you want to benefit from what society has to offer, and she's not putting it in terms of any kind of actual contract, but it's a similar issue.
There's a thing about that you have an obligation if you're called to jury duty. It's kind of like it's, I don't know. It seems similar in a way. You didn't agree to that, but you sort of.
Well, I have a view on this I want to put on record. I think you did.
Go ahead.
I think jury duty is a word that scares people off who are advocates of individual freedom, and they think then therefore it's this something they should be opposed to. But in practice, the way jury duty works in every jurisdiction that I know of is you are put on the jury rolls if you register to vote. They don't impose it on you if you don't. So if you don't want to be on a jury, don't vote. It's up to you. And it's actually, I think, quite good that those two are put together for reasons that I've heard you explain in the past, which are that part of what's important about being a citizen is that you be able to have access to the system of justice. And so in principle, anyone could go and see the conduct of justice to ensure the objectivity of the proceedings. And if you yourself want to be, now this part's new to me, but if you yourself want to be protected by justice and by the laws, and you want to have some say over how they are conducted, and that's what the right to vote is, it makes sense that you should be the one who is then putting in some time to see what happens when they are actually applied to your fellow citizens. So I think jury duty, to the extent that it's conditioned on voter registration, makes a lot of sense, and it's not involuntary. It's not an involuntary duty.
I think that's plausible, but I'm not sure, and I find the question of jury duty a little difficult. The concept of a jury and a jury of one's peers is there because it's needed or thought to be needed, or anyway, is for the service of protecting the defendant. You don't want to have a situation where you could be sent to jail or executed or have a fine imposed on you because some group of people who are prejudiced against you decided that, and nobody who didn't share that prejudice could get into the group to do it, or even it's so disproportionate what kind of people get into the group that you have no way through jury exclusion, or doing your vetoes to find a jury who wouldn't be biased against you, right? And because of that being the kind of rationale for having juries at all, right? Because why not just have the judge try you? It's, well, the judge is, he's someone who's of a certain class and power and position and authority, and probably isn't very like most of the defendants against him. There's a kind of built-in potential for abuse there and for prejudice. You want the case to be makeable to someone like you, that you deserve imprisonment. But because of that, one has to be careful about any way of getting people on the jury that
prejudice that biases the sample.
So, for example, you could say, well, people Juror could just be a job, but it's open to anybody, and it pays this much money, and so anybody who shows up, can be a juror for that much money, whoever the first 12 people in line. But then you're going to get the people who want to make however much jurors are paid, and that's going to be a certain slice of society. And if, I don't know, you're the CEO of a firm, probably you make a lot more money than the people who are going to come for their...
jurors should be paid more, by the way. But
for their $10 an hour or whatever. And so any kind of thing that it could be where people opt into it, there's a worry of, well, what kind of person opts into it, and could this be now having it selected on the voter rolls? Still, I'm sure, probably more affluent people register to vote more than less affluent people, and people with more time on their hands both register to vote and are willing to serve on the jury. And so you can worry about there being a prejudice there, but I still think there's a grounds for redressing it, which is that if you're someone who's, concerned that people of your sort don't vote enough and don't get on juries, you could advocate for them to more. But
plus, whatever concern you have there about the representation of voters would apply just as much to who gets to vote.
Right.
And
so there's every reason to be, although it does give reason to be very concerned about things that might exclude people from the voter rolls or disproportionately get a certain sort of type of person on the voter roll. So I'm not sure exactly where I fall here, but I do think there is it seems easy to say, well, people should just volunteer for the juries and you'll get better jurors because they'll be more thoughtful and more interested in doing it. And after all, you can't force a mind, so therefore you can't force people to be on the jury. But the more...
Well, that's one of the reasons I like the connection to the voter rolls, because there's a much bigger commitment. Well, first of all, you have to be a citizen to be able to vote. And and then there's, having to go and register. And there's, you actually, I can't remember if you have, I don't know if you've actually have voted, if that's a condition for then getting called, or if it's just that you registered.
I think it's that you registered, because I think it's the same list. But the just anything that gives you opt-in to jury or makes it you're there because you want to be there, creates other potentials for injustice.
But the voir dire process is pretty rigorous in excluding people who you might think had the wrong reasons to be there. I've been called up for jury duty like 2 or 3 times. I've never made it. I've never made the cut. My wife has never made the cut. So it's.
So anyway, I think it's because the issue is what is needed to ensure that there's not a prejudice or miscarriage of justice against the defendant. There's an extra difficulty here, and you might think that it's like the subpoena power. Although I don't think it's quite like the subpoena power. And so the idea with the subpoena power is that if you're in effect withholding evidence, that you could easily give, you're in effect colluding with the persecution of the person who could be freed or vindicated by giving that evidence, and you don't have a right to do that. If the nature of the society is such that for justice to be carried out, you need to submit to this.
I have a view on that too.
But that seems to be a slippery slope. So
I think subpoena power is justified by the fact that, in effect, retaliatory use of force. That the criminal who committed the crime, which created the evidence in somebody's mind, is the one who is culpable for the force that is now being exercised against the person whose the subpoena power is being put over. So their rights are being violated in effect, but by the criminal.
Or have been violated by the criminal. Plausibly. Anyway, I think the jury case is a sort of difficult case for this reason.
Yeah. It's like when somebody's trying to escape from a criminal and you trespass onto their property, and that we should wrap up soon, but I still want to go back to that topic that came up in conversation after the talk last week. And it came up because someone came up and started asking a number of questions about cases in which, do you have the right to abort the fetus in this condition? And what if it's born without a brain? And what if they're insane? And
what if it's a person?
What if the person is insane?
Right, so it's not a fetus.
And you had a very interesting response that I thought relates to some of the things we've been discussing today about the nature of rights, and what kind of thing we're talking about when we talk about a right. And you should just share what
the kind of issues is, what if they're a criminal? What if they're brain dead? Under what conditions can you kill somebody? or rather, under what conditions does a person have rights such that you can't kill them? What if they're brain dead? What if they're mentally handicapped in some other way where they're like a child for their whole life? Or like, where do you draw the line? What if it's an animal? What if it's what if you have a person who is diminished capacity such that their capacity is less than, on whatever metrics you're using, some animal, which animal you say doesn't have rights as a person, then not have rights.
And I had a bunch of things to say in response to each of those individual points, which I thought were okay, but then you had this kind of this broader principle that you used to think about all of them.
So I think the issue isn't that we're trying to determine which of these individual human beings have rights and which don't, but determining whether they have rationality, whether they still have rationality, if there's a situation where maybe they're comatose or brain dead or something, whether they ever had rationality, whether or not they ever had the features of human beings in virtue of which we think individual human beings have rights. You're not determining whether an individual human being has rights by determining whether they have that feature. Rather, you're determining that they're a human being. And what the principle, and as a human being, as an individual human being, they have rights, and what the principle of rights does is determines what needs to be proved of them before they can be acted on in certain ways. So, for example, it's because so-and-so is human that I can't just decide for myself that he's incompetent and therefore, take him under my power and imprison him and lock him up, and allegedly for his own good. Rather, because he's a human being, if I want that to be done to him, I need to go to a court and have him declared incompetent, and here are the reasons why. If it can be proven, what I'm proving isn't that he doesn't have rights, but that he's impaired in thus and so a way that he has to be dealt with, and all of the kind of principles of the procedure by which I have to do that with him comes from that human beings have rights, and rights are principles about how we have to deal with one another in virtue of the fact that we're creatures that live by reason, that therefore have to deal with one another by persuasion, that need a kind of sphere in which we can act independently of one another and need to be free of one another. And if I'm claiming an exception to that in this person's case, it's because we know that's generally true of human beings. That we need to, we have this principle that applies universally to how one can treat them. And we can talk about why such a principle couldn't, in principle, be applied to fetuses, but therefore why fetuses aren't the kinds of things ontologically that could have rights. But it's the same issue with prisoners. I think it's not that somebody who ought to be in jail doesn't have rights. As a human being, he has rights, and those rights determine that one can't imprison him except, with due process for a crime that's been proven under objective measures. And it's not like he loses the rights then. Rather, those rights are always there in the background, setting the conditions on which he can be imprisoned, be kept in prison, under which he can or cannot have appeals, and so forth and so on.
This is it's helpful, and I think it integrates with something I had also said in response to his question. I don't know if you heard this part, but it was that rights, it's to oppose the idea that rights are this kind of time slice concept. Like at one moment you have a right, at another moment you don't. And it's a time slice that's it's attached, in virtue of the particular state of being that you're in at the moment.
So your example is that somebody falls asleep,
right,
and therefore is unable to reason while they're asleep. They don't therefore not have rights while they're asleep.
And that's not what rights are for. Rights are by their very nature for the sake of protecting a certain kind of life. And human life is something that is lived in the long range. And so one thing is that rights require protection over the course of a long range. And then there's a question of how far in the future and in the past do they have to go. The paradigm is the mature adult, but for the mature adult to flourish, it needs to be that those boundaries need to be pushed forward and back.
Part of human life is that your capacities develop over time and sadly often diminish, either in old age or as a result of injury or accident. And some of those diminutions are temporary, and some of them are irreversible, and so forth. And the principle has to govern how we deal with people in light of all of those facts. And the fact that, the way we live is as rational, independent beings. Because of that, we have to, respect that this is the kind of being that could be, was, maybe again like that, when we're dealing with someone who seems not to be at the moment in possession of their faculties.
And that's what I think ultimately makes sense of why infants should be protected by rights as well, especially since if you're thinking of it as this sort of, by default, a certain kind of being has this right, and you have to have a very special proof to the contrary, even if you don't know a lot about the nature of this infant. And the reason that then you can't extend it any earlier than that is because at that point you're coming into conflict with an actual individual human being, the woman.
But the relevant point about fetuses and anything that's living inside someone is that suppose a fetus was a person.
Well, you're going to do the Jarvis-Thompson.
No, but not even that. Just suppose that we say that from blastocyst on, the fetus is a person. Well, then it's a person who is involved in a 9-month constant act of assault on a woman. It's assailing and battering her every moment of its life for 9 months in a constant. It's distorting her body. It's stretching her out. It's causing her to throw up. If it were a person, it would be in its every moment an assault on her. And anything that she did would be an assault on it. She walks across the room. She's kidnapped it and carried it over there. And they're not separate. Everything either of them does affects the other. But those are not then things that interact. There can't be principles governing how things should interact that can't but always be assaulting one another.
But then I also think the absurdity of that little thought experiment brings out why it's important you're using a subjunctive when you described it.
Right.
That if it were a person, but
right.
Brings out why it so clearly isn't.
Right. That's
why Thompson shouldn't assume that as a possibility that she needs to argue.
Should we talk about the Jarvis?
I don't think so.
I think it's a really interesting example, and
we could go on forever.
We'll look up Judith Jarvis Thompson and her violinist for people who don't know. But I think she's right though in that case about what would be true of the example with the violinist. It's just a weird hypothetical. What we're talking
it doesn't help
about
abortion because it really only applies by analogy to ending a pregnancy that happens through rape, and it doesn't help for other cases.
But I think it has this important relevance to abortion. A being that is by its nature in that condition of constantly connected to and constantly such that if it were counted as interacting with somebody, it would be assaulting her, is not the kind of being that is an individual. If you imagine...
Right, but she also says, imagine that it has rights.
Right.
So you're saying it can't even be the kind of being that has rights.
Right. So if you imagine someone that would otherwise have rights that would be put in that situation, the rights would sort of go away or be voided, or you'd need a court, or who knows what would happen. But something that's very nature is such that it cannot but be in that situation. It arises in that situation in the first place, and only through some sci-fi means can fail to be in that situation, like it's teleported out of her, or it was made in a petri dish, which isn't sci-fi. My son was made that way, but he got then implanted in someone. And couldn't have become much further than the blastocyst or whatever until the implantation. While it's in that condition, and its nature is to be in that condition, it's not the kind of entity that can have rights. It's not an independent being. Rights are about the interaction of independent beings, and the principle can't be applied. That's separate from whatever other moral principles might be applied about, what is a responsible or moral or a virtuous way to deal with fetuses or blastocysts or embryos. All that said, I think people too quickly often concede that a lot of abortions are immoral. I don't know of any case of an immoral one ever. There might have been, but
I agree with you.
You sort of have to come up with, I think, bizarre circumstances to imagine one that I would consider immoral.
Well, do we have any other... Oh, here's one last question for you. I think I know the answer to this, but let me see what you say. Anyway, how does what you just said about the nature of rights as a moral principle governing how we decide to interact with another person because of the kind of being they are by default, how does that integrate with some of the stuff we were talking about before, where we said rights are not just a shadow of a duty to another person?
First of all, I don't think rights are primarily a moral principle governing how one person decides to interact with another. I think they're a moral principle about structuring a society, right, and then about how to interact with people in a society so structured. or in light of the fact that your society isn't so structured and you have to think about how it should be structured and it's not, and you're having to deal with it. But I think it's about society, about the building of a society, the creation of a society. How does it relate to there being shadows of a duty? Well,
Or they're not being shadows of a duty.
well, that's what I don't know yet, because part of what I want to think about is what is the right way to understand this fact about various views of rights. One way you might understand it is that rights are things that are implied by a moral system. And all rights are things that are implied about what a person can claim from other people as a result of the moral system that motivates them, in which case shadow of a duty is just the version of that you get in a deontological moral system, and you get another version of it in other ethical systems, and then we have to think about what the right way to describe these rights are is effects or projections into the social of the ethical system that motivates them.
I think it's still important that even if you're thinking about another person's rights, two things. One is you have an obligation not to exploit them that derives, I think, ultimately from your own self-interest. And another is that you recognize that other people in principle are the kinds of beings for whom it would be good to pursue their own lives. And that's why they need this protection, and then there's going to be exceptional cases.
Well, I say, and I have this whole article on how it does derive from your own self-interest, you can make that derivation too direct.
Well, it takes some explaining,
Right.
for sure.
I think that
you have to answer Plato's Gyges ring problem and
but I think
really enrich what
answering it
the idea of
immediately in
self-interest
terms of you have a selfish reason to do it, and that's why you should do it, kind of skips too many terms in a way that's like saying that the Scythians don't have flutes because they don't have vines. This is Aristotle's example of a explanation that goes wrong by being too elaborate. The issue is if they had vines, they'd have grapes. If they had grapes, they'd have wine parties. If they had wine parties, they'd have flute players at the parties, and so they would therefore have flutes. But that's not a good way to explain it. It's too far.
No.
The thing that I think is essential to get a concept of rights is that they're people like me. I think the idea of equality in fundamental terms of equality among members of the species, and this is not something we talked about, but it is central to Locke, it's central to Jefferson, is the kind of important term, and whatever kind of claims I have against them for what I need gives them contrary claims against me, and that's I think that, or rather equivalent claims against me, and that's the kind of central context. And then you could talk about, well, why is that even at root egoistic? But I think to have a rights-based case, one has to.
I think you can still have moral
go
reasons
through
not to want to interfere with another person's life that don't go through that,
Don't
but then
go
you don't
through-
think of it in terms of rights.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's how I think of it, so we have another joiner of the conversation.
Hi. So individual rights are also protected by countries, the country that you live in. And so the idea,
Ideally, not always.
ideally, true, or you're traveling to that country and staying there. So there's two edge cases that I was thinking about, and one of them is when you give up your passport, right, to any country. So you're countryless, which is a possibility. So when you're countryless and you do have societal rights or universal rights, who would even protect your rights in that case? Or when you become a global citizen, as we're moving towards the future, how do your individual rights look in a society that is at odds in their moral values?
Well, one issue, one thing I can comment on at least, this isn't a general answer, but it's interesting when you look at the text of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, that it says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of law. So there, at least, you see there's a distinction between the rights of the citizen and the rights of any person. And so you're only a citizen if you're born and naturalized here, but even if you're not a citizen, you still can't, no state shall deprive you of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And so that's still nor deny any person equal protection of the laws. So there's still, at least in the United States Constitution, protection afforded for non-citizens. I think in virtue of there being individual human beings, whether or not they have a passport with the U.S. or whatever. Now, how you should, and I think there's good reasons for a country to want to protect the rights of all people in its boundaries, just out of the interests of keeping the peace. There's a lot more to say about that, but do you want to
I think of rights as principles that govern how society should be formed and structured, just as morality is the principles governing how an individual should live their lives. Rights are the moral principles governing how individuals should come together in society and how the society should be run and structured. And the principal ones are life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. And what the principles say about how a government should be structured is that it should protect those rights of anyone who's there. I think there's a proper distinction between citizens and non-citizens, because there's a difference between people who are in effect just passing through a society. I mean, I'm going to Athens in a few days, and I'm not part of Greek society, but I'm going to be there for a while, and I expect the Greek government to, arrest someone if they try to kill me and, protect my rights to the extent they protect other people's rights while I'm there. But I don't expect, for example, to be able to vote in Greece or be involved in the administration of the institutions whereby they protect rights, whereas I do expect that in America. But I think these principles have implications for I think they're kind of principles for how a society should be formed and by which we can judge the society. So I don't think any country protects these rights well enough, properly, consistently, but some do a lot better at it than others. And for example, I'm happy to be going to Greece for a few days, but I don't think I'd want to live there, and I wouldn't go to Iran, even for a few minutes. I'm judging these countries and how I interact with them. Also, I guess I'm not allowed to go to Iran, but it also has implications, I think, for what a country's policy should be towards citizenship. I believe there's an international treaty whereby no country could do something that would render somebody countryless. I'm not sure if that's true. Like, you can't exile someone and take away their passport. I think that's the case.
Yeah. Voluntarily you can.
But somebody can renounce their citizenship without getting someplace else's citizenship. I'm not sure what I think about that. If someone does that, though, and somehow was a citizen of no place, I think wherever they are ought to still treat them as it would treat any other alien in that country. And part of what you should do with aliens is stop people from murdering them, stealing from them, etc., and giving them equal protection.
For example, passing through a cannibalistic tribe, and the citizens of the inhabitants of that tribe,
the tribesmen
have the right to eat you for food.
Well, I don't think so. Part of what I mean when I say that the principle governs how a society should be, part of what the principle says is that there shouldn't be cannibalistic tribes. If you're thinking about how to organize a society, here's one way not to organize it as a cannibalistic tribe. You should organize it as a society that respects the rights of other people, including their rights not to be lunch. Granted, some societies won't follow that, and no society follows it perfectly, and there are respects in which we're all eating each other all the time and are allowed to by the laws, and it shouldn't be that way. But taking the case of a literal cannibalistic tribe, I mean, the principle says to them, stop, cut it out, don't be a cannibalistic tribe. And it says to other people, they're doing something wrong here, keep away from them, don't go visit in that tribe, you might get eaten. and maybe says some other things about foreign policy with respect to them.
One thing,
But they have no right to organize themselves into a party for the consumption of their neighbors.
one thing that both of the examples she's brought up, both the countryless person and the cannibalistic tribe example highlights, is the importance of government for the protection of rights. I don't think you have any cannibalistic societies, like literally cannibalistic societies, that have governments. Like that's a condition of anarchy.
Are there any cannibalistic? I mean, I don't think there are now.
There
Are
are
there?
small scale ones, perhaps in the South Sea Islands, or
don't know.
that's something you find in anarchism, is my point. And the state you're in when you are countryless, if you live in Somalia, which really has no functioning government, you're countryless, and that's anarchy. And I mean, you've made the point now that rights are a concept for structuring a society, and there's, contrary to what the anarchists say, you don't have that if you live in an anarchistic situation.
Right.
That is as much of a threat to human freedom as is the tyrannical government. And when you think about it, this goes back to Locke, right? What does the tyrant do but put himself into a state of war with the citizenry, which is anarchy, and it's not in principle any different.
Yeah, and what rights as a principle tells you, among other things, is that anarchy is bad. Get out of it. Try to form or organize a government where you are if you can, or get somewhere where there is one, and get somewhere where there is a better one. Yeah. And here's how you can tell which ones are better and which ones are worse.
It's almost like Locke anticipated all of the arguments that the anarcho-capitalists were going to make and kind of answered them in advance.
Maybe we could have a whole talk on anarcho-capitalism sometime. Although it would be better to do it with someone who'd represent the position more. Well, we have Brian Kaplan, who I had on this podcast a couple of weeks ago, and Yaron Brook are having a debate on this topic sometime in New York at the
at the Soho Forum.
At the Soho Forum
I heard about this.
on anarcho-capitalism in some way. Brian Kaplan for and Yaron against. Maybe we'll do some kind of follow-up on that here where we debrief the debate, or maybe we'll get Brian to come for a follow-up discussion if he's interested. Brian's a friend of the center and often around. So
we've been going 2 hours. I thought we were going to stop at an hour, but oh well.
Okay,
there was a lot to discuss.
It was an anarchy.
So see you away to Athens, where can you believe it? He's going to be speaking about Aristotle from the Lyceum.
That's true.
The actual Lyceum.
To talk about Aristotle in the Lyceum. I'm also giving a talk on why capitalism is the only moral social system. I think that won't be in the Lyceum. I don't know if they're going to be streamed. Are they going to be streamed? Do you know?
I doubt it, since it's a conference that people are paying for. But I'm sure hopefully it'll be recorded at least, so that we'll be able to see things after the fact. I don't know if they'll get the Lyceum recording.
No, I'm looking
forward
outside. Looking forward to talking in the Lyceum. That's going to be fun. I've never been there before. So that's next week. We won't be here, therefore, at our normal time next week. But there is this dialogue between me and Devin Westhill on whether there's a conflict between free speech and social justice, why there seems to be such a conflict sometimes, what these terms even mean, and different ways they're defined. And I hope that'll be interesting. I'm looking forward to re-meeting Devin, who I knew many years ago, and I hope it'll be a fun event. So that'll be on this channel as usual. So I'll see you guys all then.